glad to open this roundtable book launch dedicated to a new handbook on political populism, edited by Nomos Verlag. I'm also happy to present our participant to this roundtable, Oscar Barbera, University of Valencia, Hans-Georg Betz, University of Salzburg, Zurich, Reinhard Heinisch, University of Salzburg, and myself, in order to discuss this topic. It would be nice and important to remember some recent evolution in Western democracy. Since the 60s, 70s, we observe an emerging and often successful leaders and parties which have rooted outside the traditional party families in Europe, providing a strong anti-establishment, anti-elite claiming, often but not always, connected with an anti-immigrant agenda and anti-globalization stance, but also traditional parties and leaders which radicalize and follow the same trends. These challenges in political system can be observed in several countries in Europe, and we observe also the emergence of new parties as such like in France, Front National, in Italy, in Germany, recently with the Alternative für Deutschland, in Switzerland, in Austria, in Denmark, and so on, and also in the eastern part of Europe. And of course, this phenomenon could be also seen to what in some extent in other countries outside Europe. We remember, of course, the role of the Tea Party, the successful the achievement of Trump in the next presidential election in Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And of course, the question for scholarship is how to conceptualize, to grasp, to analyze this phenomenon. Is it a nationalism? Is it extreme rightism? Is it expression of radical right? Is nativism? Is Euroscepticism, if you look at the European phenomenon? Is a form of new authoritarianism? Is a far right? And sometimes also could be also seen as an extreme left-wing expression, and then is populist, a populist phenomenon. But the question, of course, is to define this concept, but at the same time we are in this paradoxical situation. On the one side, we use this term more and more, also in scholarship, in the literature. At the same time, we discuss about the meaning of this term, and also the significance and the usefulness of this at the same time of this concept. And the attempt of this new handbook is try to address the issue, the common issue in this field. Of course, the definition of the concept, the use of the concept, the attempt to measure also some phenomenon connected with this concept, and of course all the authors of the chapters. Here I present the list of the people involved in this project, coming from different countries in Europe, in Northern America, South America, especially. All of them try to address this question, both at theoretical level and empirical one. And of course, today we try to develop some rational, some discussion about this handbook, and with our participant here. And first of all, I can open the floor for Reinhard Heinisch, who is one of the co-editor of this book with me and Christina Holtz-Bacha, who cannot be here, unfortunately. But of course, the question is, I think, for Reinhard, is to explain a bit better why this handbook is shaped in this way, and which strategy we try to develop in order to contribute to analyze this phenomenon.
Thank you, Oscar. Can I do it from here? Or
yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, for the organization. Well, a handbook is first of all a handbook. In a sense, it needs to introduce an audience to a topic, to an area, an audience that is not already an expert audience. So, in other words, it tries to provide a comprehensive overview of an area of study, and it tries to sort of present the state of the art as we see it and as we perceived it at a given time. We also conscious that populism is a moving target, so we try not to present it as a closed debate. We not try to impose a singular definition saying that's populism, that is not populism, but we try to give and sort of try to praise this as a scholarly discourse and make suggestions as to how it is presented in the field. So there's some spread, there's some range in the book. But there are some constraints that we also focused on. First of all, we conceive of populism as we don't present it as a closed debate, but we see it essentially as we have the primary focus is European populism, and and compare it to populism in other parts of the world, but with an emphasis on the sort of European and party-based experience. The connecting theme is the crisis of representation. So present populism as a crisis of representation, and we argue that political actors, citizens, institutions react politically or discursively to a crisis of representation. All the authors were asked essentially 4 questions. There were 2 thematic questions and 2 conceptual questions. The thematic question was, to what extent can populism be explained by a crisis of representation? To what extent is populism a reaction to different effects of globalization? And then we wanted to know from the authors, where do you see in your area of expertise where are the limits of the literature on populism? Take the discussion to the limit where you see it is, and try to give a glimpse of where the discussion in your area is going. And finally, what are the leading controversies in populism research in your area of expertise? We selected a number of authors that are experts or known people in those particular subfields. We wanted to know where the controversies are, because if you are if you're a young scholar on populism, a student looking for a dissertation topic, you're of course interested not in what has been written and said a long time ago. You're interested where the discussion is going. What are the settled issues? What are the issues that are not yet settled? Where this is going? We wanted to sort of describe that particular sweet spot. Then another part, the conceptualization, we try to embrace, or we suggested, is that we perceive the discussion of populism as a discussion that started with a discursive discussion, Laclau, which then was criticized, and then we have the rise of the sort of Moodian conception of populism as a thin-centered ideology. But then, of course, the Moodian perception, Moodian populism as a thin center, worked reasonably well in a European context when you have one outsider party and a range of established parties. But as populism proliferated, and when you look at populism beyond Western Europe, it becomes harder to use this sort of antagonistic, dichotomous concept, and therefore Moody himself has really sort of come in for criticism, and the Moodian framework, the idea based on a thin-centered ideology based on Michael Frieden, well, Michael Frieden himself has said, populism is too thin to be a thin-centered ideology, and therefore we might need a different conceptualization. The advantage of the Moodian conceptualization was it is easy to measure. It allows you to measure to some extent. And the criticism of the previous discursive approach was, well, it's kind of too much up in the air. So we try to develop a conceptualization that is empirically measurable, but it is not antagonistic, and allows to conceptualize populism it allows for a finely grained conceptualization that focuses on communication, that focuses also on discourse, but connects the discourse also to practice. So for the conceptualization we propose, and we suggested to the authors, but we didn't impose it on the authors. The authors were free to reflect to us what they thought was the most relevant definition, conceptualization in their respective area. But the conceptualization we proposed was populism can be defined as intrinsically ambivalent claims diffused by individual and collective actors in order to challenge a status quo in favor of people's empowerment and elite change. And we focus on the idea of ambivalence. So this takes us back to a scholar like Paul Taggart, who likened populism to a chameleon. So it's this sort of populists who argue, for example, that their claims about democracy, claims about women, claims about various kinds of issues are inherently ambivalent, and populists tailor those claims to particular situations. So, for example, in an anti-Islamic discourse, populists will claim to defend Western women liberation, but in another context, feminists will be attacked by populists as an elite project. So populism can be very ambivalent. So we suggest a way in which we suggest the conceptualization where populism can be measured, and we suggest different dependent and independent variables, and we suggest operationalizations thereof. Because what makes this book, I think, stand out is it connects the political populism, it connects political science, sociology with communication. Because one of the main contributors to the book and one of the main editors is a very well-known German communication scholar. So it made a lot of sense for us to embrace the conceptualization that does focus on discourse, on communication, but it also tries to link communication to political practice. Because one of the criticisms that was always levied against the discursive approach, well, the discourse may be populist, but how do we know that the discourse actually has any real political effect? So we try to suggest a way in which the discursive and the practical, the policy outcome is in many ways how the two things connect. So we have a range of topics. We talk about different kinds of West European populism. We talk about Southern Europe, populism based on mobilization. We talk about Eastern and Central Europe, and of course populism in the Americas, in Latin America, and the United States. We don't just have a country focus, we also focus on populism, democracy, populism and gender, populism, right-wing and left-wing populism, but also centrist populism. So we have different themes, but also different country cases as illustrations. Everything is meant to be sort of based on empirical research, and therefore we also have a chapter on how to measure populism. But for those of you interested in some way off topics, we also have a chapter on populism and the body, because there is a history of populist leaders who come across as anti-politicians and very unconventional characters who focus on entertainment, and they use their physicality to promote their ideas. So we'll also have that in there. And with that, I think I've talked enough about the book, and I want to thank Oscar for giving me the opportunity.
So, as Georg Betz, you are one of the most important scholars in this field. I think one of the first who delivered an important book already in the 1980s on the emerging right-wing populism parties in Europe. And in this handbook, you contribute with a paper on Islamophobia. But I think your own opinion, I think, because you are, I think, already a reading of some of the chapters, the other chapter of the handbook. And my question is, whatever or not, to what extent, in your opinion, this contribution can help us to explain, to grasp better or the phenomena that we see and we call populism in Europe and beyond?
That's a good question, yes. What I'm going to try to do is kind of link what this book is all about to the evolution, basically, as I see it, very current evolution on the debate on populism. Some of the main points when it comes to populism. I mean, obviously, one has to start out with the question of definition. It started out, I guess, in terms of an ideology, then it became a thin ideology. I think now the notion that populism is really a body of ideas, and that populism is also how to frame, and this is linking up, since you talked about framing here, which I think is very important. I think a great number of people actually talk about how do populists frame issues, and how does this framing of issues then define populism. This is very much in one of the leading approaches to the question of populism is the so-called ideational approach, which particularly Kirk Hawkins is doing. As a matter of fact, we are just coming out with a new book on this, very much along these kind of lines, framework, putting the contribution into the framework of this discursive ideational kind of approach. Now, a second approach, which I actually found very useful, is a recent article which Roger Brubaker just published in Theory and Society, called "Why Populism," in which he uses the notion of a repertoire, which comes from Charles Tilly, basically, and argues that populism actually is kind of a repertoire of contestation or contention, political contention, which I find very interesting, and it resonates because I've spent the last couple of years looking into historical cases of populism, and what is really striking is that certain notions which are developed in the 19th century in the United States, in the pre-Civil War period, in the post-Civil War period, and then kind of get transposed into Europe, haven't really changed very much. And populists basically know what pieces of these repertoires to appeal to in order to basically mobilize people to go to vote for their cause. Now, a second important kind of issue, which is also addressed in the handbook, is the question of the social base. I think by now it is very well established that if you want core, or a very strong core of the constituency of populist parties, is what the French call couche populaire. Einfach die einfachen Leute. That's not just blue-collar workers, for the simple reason that blue-collar workers are diminishing very rapidly. But it's so-called, what in the old days we call white-collar workers, but basically, people who do routine kind of operations. And the social basis nowadays is no longer defined by class, it's defined by education level, which has a lot to do, of course, with globalization, with technological change and the pressures which technological change imposes on people. So that actually now, if you do large-scale kind of correlations, education comes out to be a highly significant kind of thing. A second part is, of course, gender, the question of gender, which is a very interesting kind of question on very many levels, not least because some of the leaders of populist parties happen to be women. Maybe not the most famous, actually, but certainly the best known is Marine Le Pen. But one shouldn't forget that the Dansk Folkeparti for a very long time was headed by a woman, Pia Kjærsgaard, who was very influential in Danish politics because there was a minority government in Denmark, and with the outside support of the Dansk Folkeparti. The leader of the Fremskrittspartiet in Norway was a woman, who is now Siv Jensen, who is now the minister, a minister in the government, and actually the second most important person in the French party is also a woman. She's in charge of immigration in a thing, and going out of the European kind of realm. One of the most surprising things for me was that a friend of mine wrote me an email saying Pauline Hanson is back in Australia, who some 25 years ago we wrote about when she was mobilizing against immigrants from Asia. Now she is basically mobilizing against Islam, and with that they gained 4 seats in the Australian Parliament, in the Australian Senate, and she's now, actually she's the pivotal kind of force in Australia right now. Now, with this, associated with the question of social base is the question of the role of the left. And increasingly, I mean, there is unfortunately I forgot who was it who wrote What's the Matter with Kansas? Famous book. Look it up on it, maybe. Anyway, I mean, there's very famous in America. There's a very famous book on trying to explain basically why in Kansas, despite the fact that people aren't particularly rich, they vote for Republicans. Well, he has written another book which is basically about the failure of the left, and I have a number of books from France where this question is debated particularly urgently. For example, in the pages of Marianne, which is a left-of-center magazine, about to what degree actually the failure of the left to address the concerns of ordinary kind of people has contributed to this upsurge in support for radical right and populist parties, who have now in very many ways become kind of funny. I mean, I remember Plaza Nulram a long time ago in Austria said, this eine Arbeiterpartei nur ein Typs or something like that. All of them have become that. If you look at the Front National, I mean, who do they appeal to? And where are their strongholds, at least in the north? It's in Le Nord, it's around Lille, in the old, actually communist kind of strongholds, and now they've become Front National strongholds. A third issue, which is also increasingly getting to the center of the discussion, populism, is the question of emotions. Emotions for a very long time was basically a non-issue. Certainly it was a non-issue in economics, but also in political science, given the fact that the center of theoretical inquiry was rational choice. But with people like John Elster actually getting into the question of emotions in economics and in social theory, economics has become more and more important. And actually there's a number of books. In Germany there was just a book published on Zorn, der Zornbürger. We have in German now, we have the expression Wutbürger, in order to explain basically the rise of the AfD. But also in Britain there's Raja Mishra who wrote a book, and there's a long article in The Guardian on anger. And of course the most important thing is the question of resentment. There's just in a couple of weeks ago, an article was published in Social Science Information actually on the role of emotions in populism, which talks about both anger and resentment together with shame to explain basically, I mean, the emotional underpinning of populist mobilization. Finally, the role of the media, which is also something which is in there, which is also very important. The media have, and that touches on something actually what you just said. On the one hand, the role of the media as the promoters of populist kind of discourse. I mean, I have just to give you an example of that. Today's Valeurs Actuelles, which is the only French magazine which over the last couple of years actually managed to increase its readership in France, has the title is Chassez le christianisme et vous aurez l'islam. Okay? Get rid of, chase out Christianity and you're going to get Islam. That is just one in a long kind of thing on anti-Islam in France. 2 weeks ago there was actually another woman with a burqa on the cover of the thing. But it's not just Nouvelle Actuelle, I mean, Valeurs Actuelles, which is on the right. It's also, I mean, you can get similar kind of thing, Observateur, Nouvel Observateur, you can get L'Express, you can get Le Point. I mean, all of them basically have when it comes to, or certain of these kind of things have been promoting that. And as a matter of fact, I mean, I find it particularly ironic when Der Spiegel in Germany basically talks about Islamophobia, and then you basically go and look at the internet and you find the cover where it said the Islamische Republik or something like that, with where they had a picture of the Brandenburger Tor with a Halbmond on top of it. Okay, so I mean, none when it comes down to it. The other one is called promoting populists. I mean, Trump basically was in very many ways, obviously, a creature also of the media. I mean, I wonder once in a while, I mean, I like to watch Stephen Colbert, but, you know, I wonder to what degree. I mean, Stephen Colbert is the greatest promoter of Trump. I mean, every night, basically, it's Trump. Yeah. Now, that is when I lived in Italy, for example. I give you an example how this worked. In Italy, during the summer, in August, I mean, everybody leaves the place. So obviously the newspapers, you know, they're just starving for putting something on. What does Umberto Bossi do at the time? He said, we're going to get the Kalashnikov out if things don't change. Of course, there's a big press conference. And actually, I had the chance to go to the press conference in Varese, and there was this young woman, and she got up and said, no, Senatore, you know, I mean, are you serious about the Kalashnikov? And he kind of looked at her and smiled and winked at her and said, yes. But the notion is basically that the populism, I mean, I guess you know, Haider was exactly the same kind of thing. I mean, you remember Haider, you know, on the cover. Marine Le Pen, I mean, I have, you know, and Stoß, literally, I have a huge pile of covers where Marine Le Pen, after she was elected president, was on. And that touches on this question of performance. There's actually in the last issue of the Comparative Politics newsletter, which comes out of the United States, that was dedicated to populism, and one of the articles there was on performance. Populism is, in a very way, it's always been performance. I mean, if you go back to Perón, it was his physical presence, it was his performance in the thing. Gaetan in Colombia, exactly the same kind of thing. A Boulanger, I mean, he staged his departure from Paris at the time when he was driven out to go down to Grenoble out of Paris, and 10,000 people were at the Gare du Nord trying to prevent him from leaving. And actually there are accounts where if you went to the countryside, you had farmers who had put a picture of Boulanger on the wall, basically, him on a white horse. He was the savior of France on a white horse. So populism and performance have always come together, and those who are really good performers basically get a lot of votes. And I mean, for example, I mean, certainly Donald Trump is to a certain degree a very good example of that. So I think these kinds of these major foci of inquiry, which now are central to investigating, basically, or doing research on things, jive very well with this handbook, and this handbook actually gives lots of examples, and also some help to how to approach these kind of things, so that this is really a very timely publication in that respect.
So many thanks. And Oscar Barbera, you are also a specialist, especially in politics, but you also work on populism. Maybe you have an opinion about these handbooks, because you are external, but at the same time, I think you are a very close opinion and evaluation about that. And can you give us your insight, and especially about the issue the book addressed, especially in relation dealing with the future research agenda, which are for you the main issue that in this book are useful in your opinion, because you work also on regionalism, you work on different phenomena, especially in Spain. To what extent this handbook could be useful for you?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and for bringing me here. I think the book has to be praised. It's a very sound contribution to the literature, and especially for young scholars, as Reinhard said before, because it's I think people attracted by the issue will have to look at the handbook in the coming years, and will find many answers in this book. Let me try to address your question by trying to, I would say, remark the strength of the book, and then just suggesting some limitations or some things that maybe may have to be addressed in the future. I think that the first thing is that the book covers for someone interested in populism. The book covers a very wide range of topics and of geographical. There's a lot of countries and regions analyzed here. So you can have, as Reinhard said before, chapters on the US, on Latin America, on Europe, both northern and southern Europe, both western and eastern countries. So for people looking for data, that's a source of information that you can rely on. And then it's not just the geographical spread of the book, it's also the range of topics covered, as it has been pointed out before. You have, from the history of the concept, to chapters dealing with gender. Gender has been put before in the presentations. With Islamophobia, that's your chapter. With the body, the importance of performance. So there's a very wide range of topics to be addressed to have been addressed in the book, and I think that for young scholars that definitely a very sound contribution. I think Reinhard said that before, but I think it's actually true. The book is very good in presenting the debates and the limits of the debates, where the literature is going, and in doing so in very clear terms, very easy to read, and that's something very valuable for, I think, the main audience of the book, which should be probably young scholars thinking of the PhDs, maybe the master's thesis as well. So that's something worth of pointing out. You have, for example, Oscar's and Reinhard's chapter on explaining populism in a very well structured way, which is very useful for someone who needs an answer. I don't know, you have a presentation tomorrow, what should I say? You should definitely look for your chapter, because the main topics are addressed there, so you have the answer. You don't have to look at the Wikipedia. Or for example, Sorensen's chapter on populism and communication, I think it's a very well explanation of the relationship between both subjects, and Reinhard said that before, but it's very true. The link between political science and communication studies is one of the most relevant things of the handbook. Or, for example, Lisa Lanzone chapter on new populism on Southern Europe, which is really nice, and also it's also linked with Latin American populism, because it debates not only about the Southern Europe as a topic, but the relationship with the left, and that's something really useful. Or the chapter from Tim Powland on measurement, which is actually really nice to have. and I find it particularly useful because I'm working on that at the moment, Carlos Ruza's chapter on political parties and far-right movements. This relationship between parties and movements, which has been, I would say, forgotten for the literature for a very long time. Now it becomes really relevant. I think Carlos Ruza has a lot of very strong points on that. So there's a very long list. I could go on, but I think it's not worth it. Of topics and debates that are addressed in the book and are really useful for young scholars. In terms of the limits, I would stress 3 limitations, just to provoke, and I don't know whether it will be a debate afterwards. I think the book could be called a bit Eurocentric. That's of course, most of the academies are from Western Europe, so and I think the main audience of the book is mostly focused on Europe, so that's something that can be explainable. In this sense, probably because there's more literature on the radical right than on the left. It's a bit. There's a lot more chapters on the radical right than on the left, which for me is coming from Southern Europe. I would like to have more on the left, but I truly understand there's not that much research on new left populism. It's an emerging stream of the literature, but it's just emerging. So it's probably in the future that will be more important, but that's something worth stating. The other thing, and it's also related to my work, as Oscar said, the book could be said a bit state-centric. I would like to have, and probably future editions of the handbook, I don't know, but surely your work, Oscar and Reinhard, has addressed this topic in other research projects. The importance of the regions and the link between regionalism or nationalism and populism, because you can find it in Italy, in Switzerland here as well, in Belgium, in Spain. Well, in Spain, you talk about good performance. We have the first political exile in Western Europe, so that's not bad for populist performance, I would say. So there's a lot of things here at the regional level, at the subnational level, that could be addressed by the literature, and probably in the coming future would be nice to have. And the last limitations, as Reinhard said before, there's a specific chapter on measurements. But thinking of young scholars, I probably would like to have more on methodology, for example. There's a lot of chapters that are very well structured in terms of the methodology. But thinking of how I plan I don't know, maybe a research design, trying to look on something on populism. Because in terms of theoretical conceptualization, the book is excellent. But for someone looking, okay, I got the concepts, I got the ideas, but how do I proceed now? Of course, in terms of measurement, it's perfectly fine. I think Don Paul presents the main streams and the main literature on that, but maybe something else on how can we develop that. It could be a good idea. And those are 3 provocations for the editors. I know that you have tried to address these limitations in new research that it will come in the coming future. So they're not really something. It's not something that should be worrying anyone, but I think that's worth pointing out in my presentation. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. And I think one of the questions that you arise in different ways is the question of the left-wing, right-wing populism. I think in this sense is one of the issue focused in the handbook, but not really. It's not in the center because of the specialization and of course of the experience of scholarship in populism in the last 20-30 years, especially in Europe. And what my question is, the question is about the linking between left-wing, right-wing populism. Your opinion, the opinion of Reinhard, first of all, because you have experience also on the Latin America populism, and I think how can deal really between the left wing, in your opinion, left wing populism in Southern Europe, and the tradition of the legacy of populism in Southern America. And this is, I think, it is the first connection. The other connection is the European right-wing populism and the Tea Party and the Trump experience. So you have to bridge Atlantic bridge. How you can? What do you think about? Is really a bridge? It is, or is purely analogies, or purely scholarship, academic, rational? It is a reality in terms of circulation of ideology, and in the future could be seen maybe really a connection with that between.
Yeah, I think these are very important points, and I don't know if I have good answers. Let me maybe briefly give you an anecdote and then link to a point. How did I get into populism research? And I was struck, I was working for the State Department, and I was preparing candidates who were going to be ambassadors, Americans who were going to be ambassadors to Austria. And that was in the late 90s. And in the late 90s, at these preparatory meetings with the ambassador designate, the question was increasingly turning towards this Austrian populist leader, Heinisch, who was sort of, CNN called it the most dangerous man in Europe. So a friend of mine suggested I should write a book about Austrian politics, because there was really none that had focused on this in the US at the time. So I spent 1999, the summer, with Jörg Haider. I followed him around. He had a local campaign. He was a very unusual politician. And it was a very interesting, I wrote about it later on. Then the book was published, and I thought, well, that was the end of populism. I thought, this is it, and this was an Austrian issue, and I wanted to move on. I didn't see myself as a populist scholar. At the time, I was also supervising a development project in Bolivia, because as a kid, I had partially grown up in Bolivia. And we were in this village where we were instructing an orphanage with my students from the US, and there was this group, a very folkloric group was gathering there, and they looked very indigenous, very ethnic, to an American sort of biased perspective, stereotyping people. And somebody approached me and said, "Oh, we are the Cocoa Growers Union, and we're having a workshop. Our leader, a certain Evo Morales, would like to meet with an American professor who was to exchange." And so we had this wonderful evening with the future president of Bolivia, and I was struck of the similarities between Jörg Haider and Morales. And of course, if you'd come to me and said, there's this Austrian right-winger and there's this indigenous leader, I went, no way they have anything in common, but I'm struck. There was some commonality. There was the importance of leadership, this charismatic figure. They both liked sports. They wanted to reclaim some idyllic past that they had lost. They were threatened by enemies from outside. They were great communicators. They used sports to communicate. Symbolism is very important. They had a narrative about history that I mean, Heine wanted the real Corinthians, the real Austrians, whoever they are. He had the real Bolivians, and you have to know that Bolivia's 95% people are ethnically identical because they're all mestizos. I mean, there's very few whites. There's very few not similar. They just dress differently, but they're actually. So, who is an original Bolivia? It's very much how you dress. I mean, I'm gonna look at my godchild there. If he goes to university, he looks Western. His parents look Doble Chulita. They wear the typical Bolivian outfits. But it's the real Corinthian, the real Bolivians. And I was struck by the similarities, and I found it very fascinating. And I thought, well, there is a broader story, there is a common core. But then when you turn to the literature on populism in Latin America, they teach you, of course, well, populism is a function of modernization. Modernization creates creates essentially a lot of complexity. But and because institutions are weak and underdeveloped, you can't move the country forward, so the leader turns directly to the people. Well, that wasn't really what I experienced in this kind of populism. So I didn't realize that the literature on populism in Latin America didn't seem to explain the sort of left-wing one. So ironically, I saw a lot more similarities between the left-wing populism in South and South America with some of the right-wing populism in Western Europe, in the sense of reacting to modernization, reacting to internationalization, and but moving where there was space to move to. In Bolivia, the established party system had collapsed. The Social Democrats and the National Revolutionary Party, there was a lot of space to move into. In Austria, the space was over on the right. So you see parties moving right or moving left wherever there was space, but basically with a very similar message. I mean, Evo Morales claims to be a Marxist, but he wasn't really a Marxist. Marxism wants to move to the future, progressive, internationalist. They want any of this. So in many ways, so I think we're waiting for I guess a great theory of populism that explains all of this. It's like in natural sciences, you explain the universe on the subatomic level, and I guess we're still waiting for this. But I do think, communication is a big answer. But because we're political scientists, I mean, I didn't know anything. I don't know this part about communication. I mean, I believe it's important. I see it's important. I'm probably persuaded by what I read, but I'm not a communication scholar. So, there's a big part of the puzzle missing. And maybe what we see in Southern Europe, there's a linkage. And it developed out of social movements. In Latin America, it developed out of social movements. But there's also the story of organization. The reason why the party of Evo Morales became dominant because they were the best organized group. The way Oscar and I have written about populist organization, there is behind the great leader also organization. These are parties that know how to talk to people, that know how to organize, that are doing things that political parties used to do, but they don't do any longer. They live comfortably off the state, but don't organize. So in many ways, I think there are different parts of the story that we're getting glimpses of the elephant, but not completely. But I think there is a common core, and I think reclaiming the common core is important. And I completely agree with you. We've seen just glimpses of the elephant, but not the elephant yet. But it's an ongoing story, and the problem that we have with populism, it's changing, it's morphing. It is a moving target in some ways. Populism today is very different from populism in many ways. When we had a situation where you had one outside the party and everybody was established.
Centrist populism.
Centrist populism, exactly. Now we see something like Babiš, who's is he anti-European, is he not, and he's everywhere, So in some ways, that's sort of the challenge in many ways. Now, of course, with Trump being so important, it seems to dominate everything, but the United States is always a case of one, but it's such a big case that it creates its own weather in many ways. But I would certainly want to return focus to a common core. And of course, the stories in Asia and other parts that I don't understand because I'm an expert there. But so we try in our future work, try to get scholars from different regions, but get these scholars to speak an international language, because very often they do local case studies. And then it's a bit lost to us because they're an expert on their own case, but I'm not sure how that case connects to this. So we need to find scholars who build a global map of populism, but identify what are the common features. And then we see, does the concept travel to some extent? Are there just completely different things that are going on and we're just pretending that these are commonalities? But I mean, I think we're still, the jury is still out in many ways. But I always want to go back to this sort of common core experience that I had, it's still with me to some extent.
So as your question, what do you think? Is there a bridge, a transatlantic bridge around populism? Is there populism, different types of populism? Is artifact to say we are in a populist era, or what do you think? How we can grasp that?
I think one has to start out with something which actually is quite astonishing. Populism actually originally is a left-wing idea, and these are left-wing movements. I mean, even the one which is in very many ways a precursor of some of the nativist parties of today, the so-called American Party, the know-nothings of the pre-Civil War period in the United States, they were actually left-wing in very many ways. They were pushing for women's rights. They were very much for the abolition of slavery. But they were also very much against Catholics, but they were against Catholics because they thought that Catholics were basically exactly what people think about Muslims today. They were dangerous and they would want to take over the country. But if you then go into, in the United States, into the 1870s, 1880s with the plight of farmers, and where you get the rural populism, which is not all that rural, by the way, anyway, but rural populism in parts in the South, particularly in Georgia, in what is today the Midwest, which at the time was the West, out Kansas, Illinois, and whatnot. And they were very much on the left. As a matter of fact, they were attacked as being socialists, and they actually associated with people who considered themselves socialists. They were supporting the Knights of Labor, which was the first kind of organized labor in the United States. They tried to basically create bridges to African American farmers, even if that was a very divisive kind of issue. And there was a lot of racism among these populists, but one has to understand it in the context of his time. And they were very radical in their political proposals. I mean, you had people who basically said, we gotta nationalize the railroads, we gotta nationalize the banks. There's a very famous speech by a woman from Kansas, Mary Lease, to basically, when I read it to my students in my graduate course, they think it came from, against Wall Street in 2008. No, this was done in 1880. I'm sorry, in the early 1890s. Usually the title is Wall Street Owns the Country. These were radicals. These were real radicals in the United States. Now, if you go to Latin America, I mean, yes, there's always the emphasis on Perón and to a certain degree less Getúlio Vargas, because most people don't know Portuguese, but particularly Perón. Actually, the ones to focus on are people like Aya de la Torre, who basically is a Marxist, who wants to revolutionize Latin America, and particularly Gaitan in Colombia, who unfortunately gets himself assassinated. And if you read, actually, I mean, it's really worthwhile reading Gaitan, because he's very much more of this kind of left-wing populist than is Perón, for example. I mean, if you read him, you get a totally different kind of notion of what populism was all about. Now, what all of these have in common to a certain degree is a focus on social justice. Very strong. I mean, Gaitan, very, very strong. But also the American prairie populists, very, very strong on social justice. And here, resentment as an emotion is basically really anger about the injustice of the system, which is systematically stacked against the vast majority of the people, who are not only basically treated like nothing, but with lots of contempt. And that's very important. I mean, you get these. I mean, in the United States, I mean, the leaders of the People's Party are being treated basically as this kind of hillbillies who are ignorant, who are stupid, and whatnot. In Latin America, Gaetan is because he has a dark complexion, is called El Negro. The people who support him are chided as El Chusma, which is basically the riffraffs. But what he does, and what Perón does with the Democráticos, he uses a notion of contempt and transforms it actually as a badge of honor. Yes, we are the ones who are holding up a society, who are the real people. And you get the notion between el país legal, el país político, in Colombia, between the real people and this elite, oligarchia. If you go into, and actually, I mean, if you look at the left, in left-wing populism, for example, in Spain, Podemos, I mean, Podemos is a very interesting kind of thing. You've got a bunch of intellectuals, a bunch of professors who basically read Laclau. Then they go to Latin America and become advisors to Correa and Morales and Chavez. Go back to Spain and basically say, now we are creating El Pueblo. I mean, Errichon Inigo, I mean, he wrote a fantastic article in Le Mot Diplomatique, in which he basically said, and by the way, you know, I mean, we learned you have to have a charismatic leader. So we basically, you know, kind of made, you know, Pablo Iglesias into kind of a, you know, somebody who could be on television and look cute and all of this. I mean, it's a real project. And what you use for your program, the way you use an IKEA catalog, literally. And you have Pablo Iglesias, who basically edits a book where he basically says, you know, I mean, you want to learn some of the politics? Read Game of Thrones. And he sits on the Iron Throne on the cover of the book. I mean, this is performance here, you know. But it's a left-wing kind of, again, it's a left-wing kind of notion, a deep sense of social injustice, which against a political clique, which is in collusion basically with economic, which traces back to the 1880s in the United States, where you have exactly, I mean, the senators and congressmen in the pockets of these economic kind of monopolies. You get it nowadays in Western Europe. And for me, I mean, the most ironic kind of thing is Trump in that respect. You know, who basically kind of touts himself as this kind of thing. But this kind of, I think this notion of social justice, which is ultimately the claim what Kirk Hawkins and others in now basically McLaurin, that populism appeals to a kind of a moral cosmos, has a moral cosmology. I mean, one should not, populists have to have some kind of legitimacy. And that legitimacy comes, yes, appealing to anti-immigrant feelings, but beyond that, to some, there's a moral claim. This society is fundamentally unjust. Huge inequality. I mean, what Piketty basically has been saying for the last 10 years, huge inequality in this kind of stuff. We cannot go on like that. We cannot go on that some people get bailed out because they have lots of money, like UBS in this country, and your average kind of homeowner loses his home and the money he put into the kind of thing, and nobody comes to their rescue. There is a huge outrage in many, and it's not just in the Midwest and whatnot in the United States. I mean, if you read actually, I mean, what is being written about France out in the boonies, les ploucs in France, as they are kind of called with contempt. Yeah. Famous kind of thing, les sans dents, what Hollande said at the time, at least what Trierweiler claimed that he said. I mean, this contempt for ordinary kind of people coming from these urban kind of elites. This goes all the way. I mean, it's you have it, you know, Midwest against the East Coast in the 1880s. You have it now, basically between again the coastal areas in the United States and the core in the United States. You have it in between Paris and Lyon and whatnot, and then the boonies in France, and you have it in Germany. You have it in Germany, you know, with the elites in Berlin and Munich and whatnot, and then you have the forgotten out in the middle of nowhere in Sachsen and in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern and whatnot, and they vote for the AfD. I mean, there's a deep-seated kind of a sense that things have gone very, very wrong. Okay, and I have lots of problems as a result of that with these people who kind of, you know, come up with this easy kind of painting with brushes, you know, whatever kind of thing. I mean, they do not take them seriously. And this is particularly a problem of the left, as far as I'm concerned. A very big problem of the left, which has absolutely no answers, who have basically made a pact with neoliberalism, whether it's in Germany, you know, our great Schröder, great leader Schröder, whether it was Mitterrand already in 1973, when he made the U-turn, whether it's the Clintons in the United States. I mean, basically, when it comes down to it, they have all betrayed the left-wing heritage. And now the chickens come to roost for them. Now, one last point. I mean, in that regard, actually, for me, the most interesting event over the last couple of weeks happened in New Zealand. A long time ago, I edited a book together with a colleague of mine on radical right-wing populism, and one of the radical right-wing populists was Winston Peters. Winston Peters is a Maori, he's the leader of New Zealand First. He was anti-immigration and all of this kind of stuff. Well, the other day they had an election in New Zealand, and lo and behold, the Conservatives won the most votes, but they don't have a majority. All the other parties, basically, the left came in second, third came Winston Peters, and then came the Greens. Guess what happens? A coalition between the socialists, headed by a woman, and Winston Peters, with outside support of the Greens, and Winston Peters, among other things, agreed to raising the minimum wage to $20, which is higher than anywhere else. Okay? The Greens get 1 million trees being planted every year. Okay? Now, that was really something, as far as I was concerned, that somebody who was this right-winger, or considered a right-winger, would basically go into an alliance with the left, with a very left-wing program. Okay? It can be done. And actually, I mean, in a sense, I was very curious whether they couldn't have been done in Austria, quite frankly, you know, given the fact that their constituencies are very, you know, ordinary people. This is politics for ordinary people, and you could integrate kind of thing, which means there must be some commonalities here. Okay.
So you raise a lot of interesting points, but I think here the public could be also intervene. So we open the floor now for you and for questions, remarks. Please.
You didn't give them the questions?
No. So, so the question is, I put one question from my point of view, because you say social justice, but social justice is a popular feeling or is a populist strategy? And this my feeling is about this definition, or the underlying feeling is my question is the connection or the relationship between this feeling that you can observe in the demand side perspective, in popular attitudes, in popular feeling, and at the same time you find political actor political actors able to mobilize to some extent these feelings, this frustration, resentment, fears, and so. I think this is a little bit an issue for us, because how the leaders and the parties are able to frame, to canalize, to develop, and at the same time they are to exploit what exists already. So that's I think it's a relationship very complicated to grasp, because to some extent the populist parties and populist leaders say, oh, we simply follow the demand of the people, the demand of the justice, the demand of a better life. But how we can grasp that? Because I think it's one of the limit of the scholar of the literature on that is to disentangle, to distinguish this, which because it's very complicated to say, okay, we co-construct this feeling, this content, yes, but to what extent, and how we can measure, how you can grasp this two dimension of the problem. On the one side, the feeling of the people, and the use of that by politicians. Well, I don't know who can. Oscar, please.
I'm not a specialist here.
But yes, but you have maybe an idea about that.
Spain is a good example of that.
Yes, Spain is I was thinking, that Catalonia, even in Spain with Podemos, is a good example of this, I would say, retroalimentation between the feeling of social injustice. I would start with the feeling of the left, the inequality and feeling of social injustice, and then the apparition of new radicals, new politicians at the fringes of the party system, claiming that they can address these social issues or this social injustice. And then with the media focusing on these claims, new people again feeling this anger or this resentment, and it's I think in this sense where does these feelings start, or what's first? I don't know, but there's certainly something here.
But you had in Spain, you had a movement, Los Indignados, and actually, I mean, some would claim it was a hostile takeover, basically, of the by the Podemos kind of thing. But I mean, it didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, there has to be the thing is, maybe one should, go back to this kind of, there has to be some kind of opportunity structure. It's not for nothing that you get these real, the large scale important mobilizations come not out of nowhere. There's a certain context. In the 1880s in the United States, you had the most severe depression. Actually, when people talked about the Great Depression, until the Great Depression, they talked about the 1870s, 1880s. You have really in Europe at the same time, in France, you have a huge agricultural crisis, including wine growers and whatnot, and you get the delegitimization of the political elite at the time, which gives an opening to Boulangism, which is a very brief kind of episode there. And now, if you look at the arguments which are based on Piketty or being made on inequality, for example, and this huge kind of divergence between economic growth and the growth of profits out of capital, you had these huge inequalities in the so-called in the Belle Époque in France and in the late 19th century in the United States, and after the war, actually, inequality declines, and you don't have very much of this kind of, you have normal politics, but as you really have this upturn, this dramatic upturn of inequality, together with political elites, which increasingly basically are seen as just an extension basically of these, and in the United States obviously it's most blatant, where you have to have millions in order to even become the mayor of a city nowadays basically. I mean, in the pocket of basically big money. I mean, it becomes so glaringly obvious that this kind of notion of social justice, it's not even any longer, you don't have to talk about it any longer. I mean, everybody knows it and everybody sees it. But if you don't, I mean, if you don't have somebody who basically can mobilize these things, then it doesn't get you anywhere. I mean, there are tons of countries in this world where you have lots of inequality and you just don't have a person to mobilize these things. Or you have somebody, I mean, I remember in Sweden at one point, you know, I mean, there were two characters with lots of money who started Ny Demokrati, and everybody said Ny Demokrati is going to be like the progress parties in Norway and in Denmark. And after a couple of years, they basically said, well, it was funny as we did it, and now let's close shop, and that was the end. But then Ny Demokrati disappeared literally. Okay? I mean, you know, people matter. Political, charismatic leaders do matter. Yeah. There really has to be a confluence of an opportunity structure of some person who, like Heidel, basically jumps on this kind of thing, and then amass a sense which can be measured in opinion polls. And I mean, it's not for nothing that nobody, I mean, the Front National does not talk about immigrants taking jobs away. There are no immigrants who are taking jobs away. Not even the French get the job. So, I mean, why talk about, what you talk about is Islam, obviously. And all if you read any kind of survey, I mean, and I have it in my chapter, and I mean, I've looked, you can go to Canada. It's all everywhere the same kind of thing, and Islam is fundamentally incompatible with our values, with liberal democracy, with women's rights, and all of these kind of things. I mean, this sells. If you have somebody who basically jumps onto the thing, and this is why everybody now has basically moved to Islam. I mean, the AfD, I mean, in Germany, I mean, they started out as this kind of neoliberal, whatever kind of thing. Well, I mean, they got rid of them, and they moved into anti-Islam, and suddenly Pegida comes along, which is a kind of a grassroots, relative grassroots movement. AfD latches onto this kind of thing. And now they got 25% in Sachsen. That's how the game is being played.
So, Reinhard, what do you think about?
Well, obviously there are demand side and supply side factors. I mean, and that's sort of a chicken and egg problem to some extent. I mean, if you look at the European social surveys going back, Europeans have been infatuated with authoritarian structures to a similar degree. I mean, even in the 80s, even before. But you know, a lot of these people were invisible because they either didn't vote or voted for established parties to some extent. Nobody even picked them out. Then the post-war period was a different period, and it's I'm not clear, you know, to some extent it has to do with the kind of how we ended up with after the Great Depression, that the United States played a role, Western Europe, it sort of fit together really nicely. Europe was able to produce those kinds of things the United States were too expensive to produce. So in many ways, and there was no competition from China, from Asia. I mean, that just didn't exist. So it was in many ways we were very privileged, but this was different in other parts. When you talk about the inequality, and I realize, of course, this is a huge factor, but I'm never sure, or globalization, or whatever these big words, you know, because we can't run counterfactual arguments. What's causing this? Is this simply the normal state of the world, and we're just lucky for 30 years? Because I mean, if you take everything else out, but the computer would have still been invented, the internet would have been invented, competition, all these technological things would have still happened. So we still have competition. And if China suddenly wants to be is a middle class society, I mean, that's going to have an impact on us. Just a bit, oh, let's all be protectionists, go back the way we were and pretend, let's redistribute. I mean, is that even possible? So I'm not so sure, you know, I'm not so sure whether there were actually options. That you could go back and pretend, you know, it's 1970 in Austria and Kreisky starts Austro-Keynesianism because nobody would invest in your country anymore. I mean, the financial streams would go elsewhere and you would have, you know, you would have nothing left. And when populists do run places, I mean, we have real life experiments. There was a province in Austria where Heinisch was governor. And when populists need to be popular, and when they are popular, they try to get money wherever they can get the money. So in this case, in Austria, you have to think about this. So this government of this state in Austria, the government had an annual budget of 3 to 2.5 billion euros, but needed to finance things to entertain people, stadiums, sports venues, lots of wonderful. They love bread and games. So they had a local bank. That bank was beginning to speculate to invest a lot of money in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and they needed loan guarantees of $27 billion. So a state of 2 billion gives a bank loan guarantees of $27 billion. And of course then the financial crisis came and the whole bank collapsed, including all the assets. And that is what populism also does, you know. I mean, in this kind of economic crazy frenzy, you could not resist the idea of, okay, we can't afford this. It was absolutely necessary that we have to have all these goodies, and these goodies were financed by the bank, and the bank in return had the loan guarantees. And in the end, the state went bankrupt. Austria had to bail out the state of Carinthia, and Austria will be paying for 100 years $20 billion. And that is what populism does. So I'm not so sure whether the policies that populists adopt in the name of the poor and the downtrodden, like Trump's tax reform that we just see, is really resulting in these poor people being better off than before. And I think at the end, you know, I mean, I'm wondering whether these elites that we always resent in the big cities or whatever they do, whether what the policies they propose is not in the end ultimately still better than what people. Is Hillary Clinton essentially not doing something that is actually more beneficial for these people than what Trump is? But somehow they don't. It doesn't resonate. And the funny thing is that the Austrian elections 2 weeks ago, in this very state where they ran the state into the ground, which party came out? The number one party, that very same party. So people's short-term memories are people's short-term memories are really short, and they keep running against the wall. They don't do it for maybe 5 seconds, and they start running against the wall again, and it's what you do in some ways. So it is sort of this. But it probably, as you said, you know, it's the communication, it's the emotional dimension that these parties, they're able to connect on a deep emotional level and tap into these resentments. And I think by just airing those grievances, by Trump just talking about this, it has a cathartic effect. I think that leads to an emotional bond. An emotional bond between the populist and the significant segment of the population that doesn't exist. It's the anger that's mirrored in that, and no matter of how an establishment politician tries to deal with that, there's just not that connection. I think that connection at a very deep level is a key, that in that very moment in the voting booth, you press that button, you support them. Even you think afterwards, oh my God, what was I doing? And I think in Brexit, I mean, we see this time and time again. And it's sort of course, puzzling, because as Hans-Georg Bell said, you know, we used to think about voters were rational, the rational voter model. Well, you know, people are boundedly rational. There's a very big bound around that rationality in some ways.
Footnote to that. If I had not known it, I would have thought you had actually talked about Iceland.
Oh, well, that's a good, it's a good point.
And talking about rational kind of politicians. Only it wasn't 20 billion, there was 100 billion in Iceland, and a country which has a population of 400,000. And you still have a hell of a lot of people in Great Britain who are still waiting for the money, which these characters basically in Iceland. So, you know, I mean, that was just casino capitalism, basically, you know, I mean, that's a different kind of issue, you know. Nobody was immune to casino capitalism, you know. And the last one, Haider, you know, I mean, the one you saw him, his glitzy, glamorous kind of lifestyle, you know.
So I think it would be nice to finish maybe two remarks. The first is I think the richness of the debate that you can address with through this book and the Handbook. We hope in this sense that it will be able to contribute to the next research agenda, also linking with these different topics, the dialogue between the populism around the world, between America and Europe, and of course the question, the controversial dimension of the concept, because the populism we don't agree each of us about the definition of populism. Maybe you have the same definition in this chapter, but at the same time we continue the discussion, because populism is a very complex notion and phenomenon, and because it's difficult to adopt one only notion to explain everything in politics today. And of course, the question is to continue to try to impulse new research. I think in this the body, the gender dimension, the performance, the media is probably the next most important issue to address, and we hope, of course, young scholarship will help us to work on that, and trying also to give empirical evidence and empirical analysis on these topics. So many thanks to you. A really interesting moment, and so we have an aperitif.
Okay, thank you.